that the Heiting algebra is somehow like this given structure of the world. It's like underlying everything is the Heiting algebra. Well, I mean, that's seems a bit overreaching, because it's a specific tool invented in mathematics. So now to make some kind of, to raise it to some kind of metaphysical formula for the world, that seems problematic. But I think another way to see it is that we measure these ideas by how expressive they are. So Heiting algebra for philosophy, it's only as good as it allows us to express precise thoughts about the world, and it doesn't have any kind of like other kind of manifestation besides that. It is just the expression.
Yeah, like a
it's a tool for formalization.
Like that.
Yeah, but guys, also just to make it clear, like I think that what we left last time with is that Heiting algebra or a locale is the structure of a measure, is the most general theory of what it means to have a measure. Like, not in the extensive sense. It's an idea of measure that is not committed either to spatiality, temporality, sensibility, or anything. So it's broad for that purpose. It's not about this inner structure of the things being measured. That level of ambition is what Badiou is going to say in the next chapter. Right?
Well,
what I think is, of course, today we were supposed to talk a bit about analytic philosophy, his reduction of propositional calculus to within this framework, Heiting algebra framework, all of that. And I think it's kind of, I have a different impression talking to you guys from what I get reading directly. So, but you also sometimes come up with some things like, this ruins the pretension of analytic philosophy. Look how this is ruined. And I don't really see where it is ruined. It's like, of course, it is a incredible framework. It's a very expressive framework. I agree with Dennis. But to say it like that it is also to kind of give our transcendental its due, like a kind of a, for a philosopher of language, it is giving language its due. It's because Badiou does not think of mathematical formalism as being language. So from the point of view of a philosopher of language, like an analytic philosopher of language, this is an unduly restricted vision of language, like just natural language. Okay, natural language, but analytic philosophy does not concern itself only with natural languages either, So I think there is a debate to be had in the sense of, even if you guys do not sustain this kind of, I don't know how to put it, kind of ambitious metaphysical view of what it's doing, like language is not important or something to that effect, in a sense. At the same time, everything he does is integratable within a framework that sees, okay, you are offering a very expressive tool for formalizing appearances, and this does not really makes the cut he thinks he's doing with this other tradition that he's pretty hostile towards, and this is my take on it. I think it's kind of weird. I think it's kind of, this may be, from my point of view, this may be ideological in a sense. Like I don't want to have no truck with these Anglo-Saxon guys that talk about propositional calculus and all that, something like that. At the same time, the relationships are very interesting, and there's a lot of relationships. I mean, as I've been telling you, I mean, me and Gabriel, we have this plan to do this article, and today I want to discuss some issues that might help to bring this about, which is actually kind of to show Badiou's relevance to analytic philosophy in a sense, but in order to show this, we can't really buy into Badiou's own view of what analytic philosophy is, in a sense. So in order to make the bridges, to make the relations, to make the relevant comparisons.
I agree with you, man. But at the same time, I mean, I'm not sure if this is a fair assessment, but my impression is that there are three different things, not two. There is Badiou's clearly aggressive rhetorical take on other traditions, which I think can be explained mostly by the context in which he was writing, the attempt to clear a space for his project against others, and so on. There is the actual, let's say, or a more experimental and concrete assessment of the things that are similar and that are different. And there's a third thing, which I think is which sometimes I have the impression, which is that since I had the same thing, like I'm going to present not about you, but about me, like, because it goes through the same problem. Like, I was clearly engaged with Lacan's approach, which is also an approach that has language as an operator for most of the distinctions and most of the places that you can go, you can't go, things like this. And what happens to my own intellectual process was not that I had to choose between a Lacanian approach and a Badiouian approach. What I had to do, which was sometimes more humiliating, was to realize somebody had a broader framework that included mine plus other stuff. And the strange thing is to realize that one of the effects of moving from that framework where language organizes, let's say, the boundaries of inquiry, to a different framework that preserves a lot of the investigations, but they mostly appear without any reference to language. Language doesn't have that. Language is not the category that organizes intelligible inquiries. It's other stuff that organizes those inquiries. And sometimes it lands on the same thing. Sometimes it lands on other thing. I still think it's a very hard blow because it is demoting language from a privileged position. And even though you can still reconstruct a lot of stuff from that perspective, like I can see like, oh, but this has a lot to do with the logic of the signifier. But what Lacan says about language and speech is still kind of valid inside of this. That's not where the narcissistic blow was for me. The narcissistic blow was having to give up on the compass, language as let's say, the ruler for what is interesting and what is not interesting, and accepting a different ruler. Even if in that different ruler, all the problems that interested me still are relevant. So I think that the rhetorical device, you're right. If you look at the problems, if you look at the actual literature, you say, come on, but this is so close. You're interested in something I was already interested in. But what is actually going on is that it's also very hard to accept that to keep the same things and to expand the field to more stuff, there is, like, say, a vague, a static ethos or whatever of philosophy that is changed, you know? And some things that are embarrassing become very rational, like a Plato and shit like that. Some things that are so rational and pragmatic become like weak and coward. Like it's the weakest version of that argument. Why would you stick with that if you can do that? So I think that's more about that. And I think that it's hard for me. It was very hard for me because it goes through the same problem, which is, let's say, the sort of connection between critical, epistemological realism, pragmatism, and focus on, you know, language as a condition. All those things are connected in a certain philosophical ethos that is very strong. And I think what is the hardest about, what annoys me the most about Badiou is keeping everything that I liked, but not that ethos, you know, like you go from a very strong, well-established position to something that is even more expensive in the sense of rich of ideas and concepts, includes everything that I was studying, but it is kind of unconvincing for a contemporaneous attitude. Like, okay, but so Plato, so is there a meaning for calling something eternal now that's not, let's say, pre-modern or whatever? Like, it's a weird position you're placed in. And I don't think it's about emptying out Badiou of his metaphysical, like my interpretation of Badiou doesn't imply emptying out Badiou from his claims. I think it implies being a bit more generous with the fact that it is a really violent, that rather than taking these statements at face value, you can arrive at them by simply, let's say, coming closer to the stuff that we already liked before, you know? You don't need to, okay, so now it's something else. And I think that he's very, very aggressive in that sense, and he doesn't really help people who thought in a different way to arrive at his position and to see that you don't lose anything, you just gain some extra stuff. He takes some pleasure in seeing you lose, I think, like, aha, so you were in the wrong position. Fuck you, you know? He's not like, but my position has space for yours inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, please.
But I see JP's point. I like JP's point, and I like us to talk about this a little bit more. I was hoping that he could basically provide this comparison. But the way I like it, especially when JP,
I have something.
Especially when you refer to natural language. Let's for now just drop all the references to natural language. Let's forget about language is natural language. And let's see what Badiou has done. I mean, we have read 2 books by Badiou, 2 of his Being an Event volumes. Well, we are reading one of them, and there was a volume 1 that we read. What is it that Badiou has done? Badiou has taken a field of thinking that had a large pedigree behind it, say ontology or phenomenology, and he has said that there is a better way or better tool for us to formalize this this field. And we know that his method of formalization is axiomatic. It's not critical. It's not critiquing the tradition of existing tradition of ontology by saying what is wrong with the conditions of pre-existing assumptions and doctrines in ontology. So he's not critiquing, providing a critique of other traditions in terms of ontology. He's actually providing a set of assumptions, and he's examining the consequences of those assumptions. This is the method that he has adopted here, and he has adopted in Being an Event. So the question, I think, another way for me to ask JP's question, if we see Badiou's effort in the vein of this kind of formalization, that he's formalizing a particular discipline and providing, and then the key to his formalization is mathematics, then what is really the difference between his effort and the efforts of analytical philosophers? Because their concern is also formalization of other fields, like probably the language itself, either the language of science or the language in general logic and things like that. I mean, they are providing a form of formalization in order to make a particular discipline more rigorous.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this is touching on what Gabriel's saying, that there is something violent happening in the move from analytic philosophy to Badiou. They're not completely compatible.
Yeah, my impression, I was reading a book that Badiou discusses.
Sorry, Dennis,
Kassim.
which part did you agree? Do you agree that they are different or they are the same? Because I was arguing that they are not different. To me,
I agree. I disagree that they are the same.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me just mention something. I was reading with a friend this book that Badiou wrote in his letters that he exchanged with Barbara Cassin. Barbara Cassin is a philosopher that studies sophists in ancient Greece, and she connects them with this sort of linguistic term, with the primacy of language, with the primacy of the equivocation of meaning, of multiple contexts, and things like this. And they have a very nice dialogue when they form a very interesting, charming duo, Badiou talking to her. And there is a point in the dialogue that he asks her, he says, you've read my stuff and I see that you don't like it. You find me a universalist, you find me like too Platonist or whatever. But like, what did you think about the formal proofs and stuff like this? And she says, I don't care for it. And he then says something which I found so profound. He says, it's funny because in the end of the day, the guy who trusts the absolute has a sort of sweetness. Like, I'm the generous one with regards to you. I have a place in my system for you, but you are the one who doesn't want to see language for what it is. I showed you a piece of language and you said, no, I don't want to read it. So the primacy of language for him is a strategy that involves negating something about language. And I think that I discussed this with Caron a while ago when we gave a course last year. I presented something about Badiou, and I was mentioning that the 20th century, I think, dealt in the beginning with a sort of very complicated question, which is language determinants, like works through determinations. So to be rational means to come up with determinations through language. But what about talking about the indeterminate? If I want to not specify, if I want to get to being, and being is not a determinate being, but is being in general, language is in a pickle because you want to talk about the indeterminate with determinate means. And it seems to me that the greatest strategy in the 20th century to answer to this problem, which is more continental, but I'll get to the analytic in a second. The greatest continental strategy is to say, the poetic dimension of language is language in its indetermination. So the poetic aspect of language's inconsistency will drive me closer to being, because if being is inconsistent or indeterminate, language gets more indeterminate when you give it this poetic operation. Now, there is another option, which I think is the analytic option, which is to say, that's not true. There are two ways to arrive at the indeterminate. You can arrive at the indeterminate by loosening language, by going from a determinate language of concepts to a poetic operation, but you can also move further into determination. You can come up with determination so specific in language, so consistent, that you end up speaking of nothing at all, speaking only of structure, speaking only of relations and not of things. So there is, let's say, a rational theory of language, closer to logic and so on, which is analytic. And there is a more poetic use of language where it's the inconsistency, is the critical, poetical aspect that opens up to the connection between language and existence. Now, what is different about Badiou is that I think that he looks at the analytic solution and he says, you guys both of you still have one presupposition in common, which is that language remains connected as a field, no matter what operation you do to it. Meaning, like Caron just said it very clearly, like, oh, but axiomatic is still language. Like, he's still doing it with language. Sure, but just like last time we were talking about how experiments require nature to disconnect from itself, if there was only one natural system, There were no closed subsystems. There could be no mechanical science, science of mechanics. There could be no experiment because, right? But the same is valid for language. That's why axiomatic is just like an experiment, because it is a part of language closed from the rest of language. So if there is axiomatics, sure, but if there is axiomatics, there is no concept of language. There is no sense in talking about linguistic terms because there is no such thing as language. When you say,
well, it loses. So I get what you're saying. So the difference between grammar imposed by axioms and the use of language is that axioms are not deterministic. Whether the language is deterministic, it comes up with concepts that determines or predicts or implicates certain field of reality, whereas axioms are just the other way around. Axioms are following the field of reality or the thinking or what is happening in that field.
So that's the word that I think is the complicated one, which is the moment that language, natural language, formal language don't form hierarchy of the same thing, the same quality, the same field, that these things can become so distinct from each other that they have no relation, to the point that a champion of language like Barbara Cassin can look at the formal system and say, I don't read that. That's not in my field. That's like a phenomenological proof that language is not all connected as a field. Like she says, I don't care about this shit.
I think it's kind of overstretching to say that this is a proof of any kind. I mean, she doesn't like.
Man, I'm doing like a nice anecdotal story, like it's a rhetorical device. But you get my point. What a proof.
Okay,
but it's important because
that may be the jerk in the room a little bit, because at the same time, I think let's see the other way around. First, I will delve into that a little bit afterwards, but there is somebody within the analytic tradition that says exactly this, which is Carnap. Carnap says, yeah, languages are things that we can do. I just can make up a syntax. I can make up the, semantic field for it, and there you go. And there is no unity between languages. There are no correct rules, universal rules. You can do whatever you need for a certain task, a certain domain, and all that. So it is this idea that language is not one. It's not a stranger to analytic philosophy. There are some philosophers within the analytic tradition that think that language is not one in a certain sense. But at the same time, I think you can't really get out of language by fiat, by saying like, oh, what I'm doing is not language.
No,
like if you have a.
But I think JP, the crux of it. No. I remember reading an article by Lotman.
That's what I was going to quote him. Yeah.
Yeah, he was basically juxtaposing these two different approaches, the axiomatic approach and the linguistic approach to sciences, let's say, or to mathematics. That the difference is not that they are not using grammars in order to connect the constructions with each other. It is whether it is the grammar or the constructions that are determining, or whether the experiments or the actual involvement with the work, the actual ontology of what you are involved in is determinant. So he's saying that the difference between linguistics, to Lautzman at least, the difference between linguistics and axiomatic is whom are you putting, or which apparatus are you putting in the position of determination? For axiomatic, it is not the grammar that is is the apparatus that is in the position of determination. Whereas for linguistics, it is. Actually, linguistics itself is what helps discover various fields of of constructions or build different areas of constructions. So I think this difference is very important.
I agree. I think another way of approaching it is to say, like, if you can have a consistent, interesting discussion on, let's say, how different can the tools for construction be? Sure, that's a linguistic approach, let's say, to the logical space, engineering approach to the infinity of logical spaces, logical syntaxes you can have. The question of why this rather than that path? Why did this guy choose this tool and not that tool? It's not given by that professional of engineering. He's not going to tell you why that path and not that. To talk about this, which brings the subject back in, you need to talk about, like, you kind of fluctuate towards a different way of talking, where you're interested in the connection between construction and what is constructed. If you begin working in this way, something starts to appear, then that thing starts guiding what you're doing, and what you're doing starts to determine what the thing is, which is a classic Parmenidean thing about thinking and being connected. You're thinking, and the thinking is something itself, or it's being already. So you shifted away from the discussion of what are the tools to a perspective where the intelligibility doesn't come from the tools. And I think that that's the essential thing. That's the broadening of it. Like, sure, multiple languages for multiple.
The intelligibility does not come from the tool. I don't see how the intelligibility does not come from the tool. I think it comes from the tool and
really
not just the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but don't you feel like the tool is? I mean, the question is this the right tool or not is a relevant question.
Well, it is
a relevant question in the sense that if I change my tools, probably the results will be different, and the kind of error that I will be at reflects the fact that the tool has some mismatch to the result.
But
that I was expecting.
What's the theory of that mismatch?
But perhaps a different result might arrive with a different tool, and it's more interesting. I don't know. We don't know.
But I think the method is different. Again, quoting Lautzman, he makes a differentiation between generalization and generalities. He's saying that since Aristotle and he assigns or he ascribes the generalization in general to the effort of linguistics is in order for us to understand things, or in order to expand the field of investigation, we are creating concepts that are subsumed by bigger concepts, so on and so forth, until a certain set of ground rules or laws that basically set provide the ground for the entire field. He's saying axiomatic is different, is as opposed to generalization. They are generalities. The difference between generalities and generalization is that generalization is a scaffolding, that each level of generalization is always dependent on a lower level of generalization. Whether in terms of generalities are independent. They are independent framework or scaffolding that if the investigation within a particular field basically either contradicts a particular generality, which is the real of consistency for generalities, you just come up with another generality, because coming up with the different generalities that are independent are much more provides a much more flexible way of formalizing the field of investigation than going and undo a whole bunch of generalizations and therefore the entire branch of investigation based on those generalizations, because they are all connected with each other.
For example, a good practical example of this is intuitionism versus the FC approach, right? From what you're saying, Caron, the validity of infinity is given by the validity of the tools. Well, the validity of the tools, a better linguistic version of them is to say, I can construct some stuff, I cannot construct other stuff. Why would I accept something I cannot construct? You're generalizing from, let's say, in truth, what they are doing, but they're not saying is, they have a formal idea of what it means to compute and to construct, which is already a mathematical universe, but they don't say it. And then they say, I will only accept things that are kind of isomorphic or constructed on top of this idea of what thinking is. So they determine thinking as a constructive process. I can only do one thing after the other, and these things have steps, and I have a finite amount of steps. I will only accept proofs that are compatible with the tools. How do you explain people who say, but I want to think infinity, and I have a much richer theory of infinity if I just put it as an axiom? That approach says, I don't care if the tool, that's not my tool, because the thing I'm thinking, it's much richer if I start with this other stuff. So
yeah, you're changing the tool.
But why did you change the tool if the tools are the ones that explain things away?
No, I don't think the tools explain by themselves. I mean, the interrelation between the tools and the thought.
Yeah, but that's my point. Like the theory, sure,
yeah,
but
whatever is being modeled.
Nobody said that tools are not important. Language is not important, but it's very different to have language as a question inside a field and have language defining the field of questions. That's the whole thing I'm telling about language as a ruler for proper and improper questions. Like you decided this beforehand. That's a metaphysical thesis. That's not like a situated inquiry. Like you already decided beforehand that this is always the best way to evaluate. And that's the equation that Badiou doesn't agree with in the Fregean logicist approach. Like you guys decided beforehand that logic is always the best framework for talking about the consistency of what happens inside that framework. And how do you prove?
Yeah, I don't read it like that, really. I don't read Frege like that. I think Frege discovered something and he tested that there's something he discovered within, you know, let's see if we can solve some, what results can philosophy give us if we change the framework from, you know, a framework based on consciousness, on mental life in a sense, on thought, to a framework based on these tools, on these formalized logic tools, you know, these formal logic tools. And it changed a bit, right? It gives different results, right? What I think it's interesting is that what you are talking to me is something that I feel most closely to, actually. There is a kind of a zigzag between, you know, object and method. And in my reading, I don't think, you know, somebody like Bertrand Russell is doing like, I am legislating out of language, which I know what it is, what it's supposed to be. Like, I don't think he's doing that at all. Like, for instance, the theory of definite descriptions is something, it's kind of a so counterintuitive result, you know, that comes from the very fact of the availability of a certain formal machinery. Like, okay, what if I define this stuff in this way with this formal machinery that can relieve me from being ontologically committed to so and so? And then you get a result, and the result is dictated by the formalism that is at hand. He can do this. Like Kant couldn't do it. Like with syllogistic, you couldn't do that, and now you can do that. So you can arrive at a deflationary result, ontological result with a tool that is, from the point of view of the analytic philosopher, linguistic. And linguistic tools does not mean like just one type of thing, you know. It just means that you are using in a very broad sense, symbols and algorithms in a sense. So this machinery is available. Suddenly certain results become available too, because the machinery was there. Without Frege, it wasn't there, you know. So I don't really see the determination coming from just, you know, there's nothing dictating me that I ought to think of singular terms in terms of definite descriptions. There is a program that is, you know, like a consistent program that tries, the objective is to deflate, you know, abstract entities in Russell's program, and the result is only available because the tool is available, in a sense.
Yeah, but why? What's the problem with that? That's not. I don't think that's what's at stake. Like the question is.
Yeah, but I don't see how there is some abstract structure out there dictating me to, you know, think of singular terms like this or like that.
No, but I don't think that's what's at stake. I mean, I'm not.
And the way I think the real of the situation, actually, what it gives me is, you know, constraints and affordances. And because of the constraints and affordances, like my tools behave in a certain way rather in another way, because of constraints and affordances that are actually detected because I have the tools, in a sense. Without the tools, I cannot detect this thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
You see, this is kind of a transcendental approach, in a sense. Like I think I'm not totally convinced. I mean, I really love the book, but I'm not totally convinced that it is a transcendental approach in that sense. It is kind of a dogmatic approach, in a sense. If he's saying that consistency results from you know, High-think algebra, I mean, no, I don't think High-think algebra is something inscribed in the very, you know, texture of the real. I mean, it is a framework, a powerful framework that you are proposing to make thinkable things. This I agree. Make thinkable things that weren't thinkable within that other framework. You know, the linguistic one, the propositional logic one, and all that.
I mean, I just disliked. I mean, clearly from everything we all ever discussed about Badiou, there's absolutely nothing that suggests that when he's doing ontology, he's talking about things inscribed in the real. Like,
oh, he never says.
Never that. Ever said that. Like,
I mean, we read this several times that he says that this field of investigation is motivated by certain thoughts, like the thought of the consistency of the field of appearing. He never said that this consistency of appearing is because it is algebraic or anything like that.
Yeah, the reason why I'm saying this is that, I mean, you always complained that the chapter on subject is the first book. And like, I tried to hammer this point down as much as I could, that this is only useful for people who think there is an empirical existence of the phenomena he described in the first book. If you don't think that thing is relevant, you don't need this book. Because you don't have to include into your framework those phenomena. Because they are decomposable into other constructible phenomena. This book only interests if you need to find a larger framework within which unconstructible thoughts must be also included. If you are reducing it back to only constructible stuff that you just see and you say, look, it is there. You don't need this, you're right. And the extra power that High-think algebra give you over propositional logic or whatever, it's there to account for that sort of stuff. So the point is that
I think it's there to account for this other stuff under a certain ontological commitment. This is my argument.
But that's my point. The first book is about the ontological commitments he's giving. He's saying,
yes,
I want an ontology.
That is a supplement to the tool. This stuff does what he thinks it's doing.
No,
but
I mean,
it doesn't do it by itself.
That's what I understand. Like, that's where I don't understand, because when I try to translate the things that you seem to dislike back into my own approach before, like with Lacan and things like this, I remember feeling a similar resistance in the sense that it's always possible to reduce what Badiou says back to these models, Lacan models, analytic models, because we have a concept that is all-encompassing. Like I can always say, and Lacan did say it, yeah, but these guys were doing mathematics, they cannot do it without natural language. So they say they're doing something separate, but they're just doing like a subclass of what I do. I talk about language in general. You talk about a specific language. How is that more general than what I'm doing? And you can always refer back. The thing that Badiou is trying to show is not that there is no language. Let's not talk about language. I mean, one of the central concepts of being an event is the idea of what we call subject language. It's the idea that sometimes you have languages and grammars that are only valid within the process that they are. Like the idea of revolution, the idea of that workers are more equipped to think through a certain situation than intellectuals. There is a language at stake in that interior process that is only legible, intelligible, and connected to reference in the process. That's what he's saying that exists. And that idea is an idea about, let's say, fragments of language that are disconnected from a general framework. There are, let's say, pockets of language rather than a broad theory. If you reinscribe that pocket back into the general theory of language, you get what he calls a constructivist approach, which is always possible, it's always legitimate, but it's less cool, it's less fun. There are some things that look rather stupid from that perspective. You say, yeah, revolutionaries are using fucking language. They call revolution this level of like there are analytic Marxists that do exactly that. They say, well, what we call by revolution is a certain series of processes. We can objectively check if those processes were happening. If they were happening, the word has a reference. If they're not happening, it's not there. So there is a position for a philosopher to go check the reference of statements and see if they make sense or not. He's saying that there is such a thing as a subject language in such a way that a process can produce its own conditions of information, which is another theme of being an event. And it's an essential part of the generic procedure that connects extracting information from an unconstructible in such a way that the constructible version of that subset would never extract that information. So the idea that language can be decomposed into fragments is not simply the idea that language is not one. It's also the idea that intelligibility of certain languages are connected to the process that you're going through. Even if in a second moment, it might make more generally rational something. That process is isomorphic to a problem of axiomatics, and it gives the consistency to his project because ontology is itself such a process for him. So if you accept the premises of his ontology, you already accepted that such a thing exists because there is a fragment of mathematics that is doing this. So it's consistent with the general frame and the special case. And that's what he's interested in making rational. If those things are not rational or not interesting for you, this is unnecessary because then generic supplements and models are reducible to constructibility, and then constructible mathematics, intuitionist approach, logicism, they are all valid format, all valid approaches. They are perfectly legitimate, and you're not missing anything, because at no place will this discrepancy between languages require you to talk about thinking. You never need to ask the question, but what were they thinking? You can always talk about what were they saying, what were they doing with language. And that's why I mentioned this idea that when language decouples in such a way that to understand this new fragment of language, you need to ask about thinking and not about language. That's the whole machinery is to make that rational. That's why it's not based on, language is not the ultimate, the last instance, and thinking is the last instance. Because this broader framework allows for that different relation to language, which he calls subject language, where the meaning of statements is not given by a general framework. And the moment that you move to a general framework, you lose the things you were talking about. And you don't lose simply the power to recognize, you lose the things themselves. So that's why the chapter on the subject comes before this stuff. And I think that also other argument we made about that chapter. Badiou is not about criticizing people. He's about proposing a more general framework. He's even worse an enemy because he's not satisfied with destroying the opponent. He likes to, let's say, own the land where the opponent is living and charge rent. It's much worse, much more contemporary form of destruction. Because I don't think he would be interested at all in debating his language this, his language that, is Russell correct, is Russell not correct. His point is, there are such things as these weird processes where you learn what you're doing as you're doing it, and the very means to make it intelligible are not transferable to other processes. The ideas are heterogeneous amongst themselves. They're more heterogeneous than language. That's why we need a theory of ideas and not of language. Because if we track language, we assume that there is more homogeneity than there is. If I look at science, art, politics from a language perspective, they will seem more similar than if I look at their ideas and the way that people develop this relation between method and object and what they are interested in making intelligible and what doesn't work and what an error means. There is no general theory of those things. And I think that analytic philosophy did a really big service by stepping back from all these fields and asking about their composability. I think that that's true, and as you and Reza said, but it generalizes two concepts, language and norm, that you can have either one or the other. And those are not general concepts for Badiou. They are local concepts. There is no general theory of norms. Norms in an artistic movement, in another artistic movement, in a political movement, in an old political movement, those are not general. Those are contextual. And I think that that's what he adds to the table. You need another primitive concept out of which specific regional languages can be derived. You cannot start from language, otherwise you will suppose a homogeneity where there is none. Now, if you think it is homogeneous, and if your life is spent in an existential situation where these things are homogeneous, you behave in politics as you behave in love, as you behave in art, and so on and so forth, there's nothing to be explained. Those things are the same, sure. But you says a constructible approach is legitimate. It makes sense. It's irrefutable. There's no critique of it to be made. You can only show it's not fun. There are more stuff. And I think that's the argument. The argument is not a critical argument. But there's a presupposition.
It limits thinking.
Yeah, you can think more stuff. So that's the argument, you know? So you'll never find, like if you're looking for refutation, like I was looking with Lacan, they will never get me because I can always give you the language twist. You give me the generic proof, but it's written in language. So I don't need to change anything. I will always win. But you're winning at a game you shouldn't be pleased to be winning. Like there is no novelty.
No, I'm not pleased to be winning anything. I genuinely don't see like how this is completely, or in what sense this is completely autonomous from, the linguistic presentation of this stuff. Like being an event, there's ontology and there's meta-ontology. I get the sense that, what he says about set theory is only ontology because there is the philosophical supplements to it, because without it, it's mathematics.
Well, the sense that I got from your question, which was interesting to me, JP, was coming back to your comment, which I didn't pick up when you were talking after Gabriel mentioned. I wanted to hone into that comment. So the sense I was getting is if if formalization effort at the distance for both linguistics and Badiou are performing rigorous formalization to certain fields of investigation, right? So it is very interesting to know why Badiou is so opposed to what linguists do, because linguists basically perform the same operations, or they are performing the same kind of formalization. I think the short answer to this is, for Badiou, the formalization is axiomatic. It's not linguist. It's not based on constructibility of the language. Whereas for linguists, the concept is not axiomatic. I think this is a very important question that we need to explore. That for Badiou, what linguists do is putting the cart before the horse. For Badiou, every field of investigation starts by a set of axioms that just allows intelligibility or minimal intelligibility of that field, and then language comes after. Whereas for linguists, it seems the beginning is by creating a certain laws in order to express the thinking. This is the difference. So for the difference between Badiou and I'm not defending any of them. I think this is a very interesting field of research that we need to perform. This is the difference. It is not, like Dennis said, it's not that they are the same. They are different. Whether this is the proper way to approach it or the other way to approach it is a different discussion. But the fact that they are different is clear to me, at least.
Yeah, I think there is a clear difference. I mean, I would not state linguist versus axiomatic. I would state something like axiomatic versus definitional. Like his approach of ontology is not definitional. It's not starting from a definition of what being is.
Correct. There is no definition.
His own terms, yeah.
So
there is no definition in axioms.
But for me, not being definitional is not the same as being non-linguistic. You know, I mean, it's not definitional. There is the statement of an algorithm of certain rules of unfolding, right, that give certain consequences. And there is a philosophical interesting justification for this being ontology, which is the idea that is a presentation of presentation, which is, okay, this is so empty. There's a reason why it is not definitional. And it's a philosophical reason, in a sense.
But he never said the opposite. But look,
no, I'm not saying that.
Can we just, I mean, there's a distinction that I think it's in the background of this that I find very important, which is, and I think that if you are a Marxist, if you are Fregean, if you are, I mean, from the 20th century has a lot of investment in this basic idea, which is, you know something when you derive it theoretically from your premises. Like, that's why I think the idea of emergent properties, the idea like complexity, the idea of construction, they all have this computation, they all have the same idea. Like, I know something when I construct it. It can be complex simulation, like meteorological knowledge. It can be like critique of political economy, when you know the material conditions that constrain consciousness, whatever. But it's always this sort of approach. And the idea that it harbors is that the relation between the material substrate, and the thing that's constructed out of it is always one of determination. So I want material substrates to determine what they condition. So if I start from a human being practicing things, I don't want to accept a domain of existence that is not determined by the previous domain that I accepted. So we don't accept very easily the existence of a dependent field that is not determined by the rules of its substrate. So for example, if without language there is no mathematics, the idea is that language gives the determinations of mathematics. Because it's weird to think that there is no mathematics without language. Mathematics is dependent on language, but the thing we call mathematics is determined from another place rather than language of which it depends. So yeah, we want to derive it from the substrate determination.
The other place, you mean?
Yeah, we want the other place to be determined by the thing it depends on. How the fuck can it depend on something that doesn't determine it? Right? But that's exactly what axiomatic is made to do. It's made to extract the generality of something that is not the generalization from its substrate. Like the things you cannot derive from the substrate, but they're nevertheless dependent on it. Like the theory of infinities is written in a finite way, but the rules of the finite writing don't give us the determinations of the theory of infinite cardinals. What the fuck is the relation between these two things? It definitely, absolutely depends on language. Nobody's here a stupid person saying thinking exists without language, philosophy exists without language. What we are not...
I actually think you could say that thinking exists without language. I think you could say that, but
okay, no, but let's be even more strict.
Algebra or greater cardinals, it couldn't be expressed by these concepts because you know those are dependent on language.
No, but yeah, let's put it even more strict. Things expressible only with language are not determined by language. You say, what the fuck? Like that makes no sense. Like if language was not as complex as it is, these things would not be thinkable, expressible, investigatable. But now you want me to...
This is very dangerous.
Sorry?
Yeah, this is very dangerous. I think this is a dangerous line of reasoning because if you don't have like a kind of a gap between what is an internal to language, you have to presuppose internally to your language a kind of gap between what you are describing and what is conditioning it. Like you end up being full idealist. Like I have this.
Yeah, that's your presupposition.
My friend.
Yeah. That's my point. Like people who don't like the field that doesn't take axiomatic to be a proper approach to stuff. And now that we enter this, you guys are gonna have
saying that.
Okay, but look, this is my point. And you asked for it, so I'm gonna do a drawing. So let's say you have here a substrate. Sorry. Let's say you have here a substrate which is finite, or it has some determination. You call this, let's say, formal language. It has a finite amount of symbols. It has some operators.
You're getting better at it.
Yeah, I bought a pen. I'm very happy.
Wow.
I see.
Oh, amazing.
Yes. I want to perfect my drawings. Now, the point is, of course, without this, we could never arrive at a different space here where some propositions are true. Like you can write something like this, such that X belongs to whatever, right? Some other stuff. From manipulating this, you arrive at certain results. Like, I don't know, some crazy cardinal like omega, right? So it's usually, and I think that this is a habit of thinking that has a very good reasons to be so, but I think that it has problems. We assume that if this, sorry, let me put it the opposite way. If this depends on this, right? These things here, you would never even express omega without a formal language. So if this depends absolutely on this, it's not a weak dependence, it's very strong dependence, then this determines this. To the point that there is we are allowed to limit this based on the limits of this. This seems to be materialistic.
Yeah, I disagree with that.
What do you disagree?
Okay. Yeah, I don't think this is sound really. Like there are different accounts of this relationship. Like you may have like a finite collection of symbols, whatever, but you have like an independent layer, let's say, of experience or whatever what you are looking at. And these things that are happening are not dependent upon your string of symbols, you know.
Sure.
What you get is again you are reinstating a kind of a transcendental. Like, yeah, I have, let's suppose that language is like a structure that is finite. That, I don't know, there's some infrastructure in my brain that makes me be able to say so and so. And so things that are happening that are not propositionally structured around me, they become propositionally structured because I make it so, in a sense.
No,
but this doesn't mean that I make what is happening. That what is happening is dependent upon the string of symbols that I use.
Okay, that's not what I'm arguing.
My symbolization is fallible. I may have to revise things. I may have to construct another language. I may have to construct a Heyting algebra for phenomenology, for instance.
Yeah.
There is mind independence, you know, and I don't see how, because there is dependence upon expressing something, the domain that is being expressed is completely dependent upon the string of symbols. No, because they are only partially formalizing the stuff that's going on.
Okay, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just trying to make a simple argument, and not refined and sophisticated, but just an argument to explain why axiomatic is an alternative and powerful way to delimit an interior process. So my point is that there is a generative approach that tends to prefer this sort of thing, where we have primitives here, and we have something that generates here. So the only thing I'm trying to talk about, which is what Rez already said about generalization. Like, of course, everyone today is trying to account for, let's say, the effectiveness of mathematics, the independence of mind, things like this. But the question is, are the tools to do this and the way we do it the best way? And if you accept that, let's say, where do I want to get it? You can change determination to something like differentiation, which is weaker. But it's still the idea that the relation between the substrate and the thinking is one of differentiation. It's still one where there is something to be learned by doing this, or by referring one to the other. It's a very weak condition. I'm not talking about determinism, reductionism. Those are the strong, almost.
Yeah, like you mean like compositionality, something like that.
Any of those ideas. My point is that what Lautmann was talking about is that rather than this generalization, rather than the idea of differentiation, axiomatics is a way to separate this field here based on indifference. And that's my point. Like, is this development entirely determined, supported by language? Sure. But if you want to follow it on its own terms, you need to give this border here some level of indifference with regards to its substrate. Axiomatics is basically a way of saying there are things to be learned by giving the interiority of this thing here, its own starting point. In other words, a disconnection with regards to its substrate.
Actually, what I suggest is, I don't think that we can resolve the difference between axiomatic and, to JP's point, definitional, or the general approach that Badiou has from linguists in this session. Can I suggest that we pick a relative text, like by Lautzman, for example, and one by Carnap or anybody, and then we present in one of our meetings in order to hone into the differences between these concepts, because right now we are just throwing around probably the terminologies, like difference between generalization and generalities and things like that. I completely agree with what you're presenting.
I get what you're saying. I mean, yeah, I'm not really that familiar with Lauffman, but I'm a big fan of Salamé, and Salamé talks about generalities a lot.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to give an account of analytic and philosophy. I'm just trying to give an account of why it is that rather than determination, difference, in terms that generally are connected with a general concept or general approach based on language, but you is just including into our framework stuff that is made and dependent on language, but has a certain degree of indifference to this general framework. So when I'm trying to answer to Caron's comment that, yeah, but in the end, this is all reducible back to the language framework. Yes, it is, but you're losing something.
But
yeah, but I think we interpret differently what it means to be reducible back to the language. I mean, we are interpreting this differently. Like, we had the same discussion. This same discussion was in the background of, you know, that whole discussion about art, about the independence of truth procedures and all of that. In the sense that, you know, in my work, I was battling precisely against analytic philosophy on one side, and against, you know, Cage and then post-Cage aesthetics on the other side, trying to use some results of both, right? And what I wanted is, which I think is it's legitimate, it's a good result from, you know, the Badiouian framework, is a certain kind of autonomy, because, you know, ontologists don't get to say what art is, because artists are doing all the time different things with it. But at the same time, what I find kind of lacking in Badiou's framework is an internal account. Of course, he has his argument. He can always defend himself from it, because he says, okay, this is not the business of a philosopher and all of that. But at the same time, I find kind of lacking the internal dynamics of the truth procedure, in a sense. I'm not sure
there's
this
hundreds of pages.
This is the same as saying. I'm not sure this is the same as saying that, well, I want a generalization of the field of art. I think no. I think there are some pieces, some formal tools that can be used and refurbished, in a sense, like remobilized, in order to arrive at a different algorithm within the same truth procedure. So what I think there is something that I don't find there. There is this internal dynamics of a truth procedure that, in a sense, will need a link. Let us say let me not use linguistic framework. Let us say a formal framework or an algorithmic framework or something like that, in order to see what's going on.
But that's the whole point of the end of being an event. Like, I think there's like 100 pages on this exact topic. Like, if you can construct something inconstructible with these weird singular processes, how can you talk about those things? There's a whole theory of it's called subject language, which is based on the problem of how do you extract information from an unconstructible subset. There is 100 pages on this. Like, what I don't get is that. What?
Okay, go on. Sorry.
What I don't get is.
Well, go on.
Like, what I don't get is, like, let's say, that's why I began by saying I think there are 2 points of resistance. There is, let's say, a resistance to the arrogant, aggressive characterization he makes of scarecrow characterization of analytic philosophy. Sure, but there is also the resistance to arrive at the same ideas, meaning not to lose any ideas and problems, but to lose the framework where certain words and concepts are, let's say, the big light, like the things that give light to the field. And sometimes I feel like you are worried about problems disappearing. And I think that we gave a lot of proofs, both in our conversations and by finding interesting questions concerning quantification, concerning, let's say, similarities to Carnap and things like this. We brought back those problems. That's not that difficult. That's very fruitful, but it's very unfruitful to resist the fact that to be able to make those transitions, you need to accept a framework where language doesn't have the place that it has in that other framework. So to transcribe the problems and to transcribe the ideas, it's much easier than to keep these basic big words in the same place. They're not kept. Like, he makes most of this without reference to these ideas or to constructing those problems in those terms. Sure, but the problems are still here. We can still discuss them. And I feel like sometimes the resistance is to the idea of this is such a scarecrow construction of analytic philosophers. And I feel like he makes the same thing with Lacanians. He says, like, Lacanians are obsessed about death. And all Lacanians fall into this trap and say, but death drive has nothing to do with this. And then like thousands of articles about how Badiou misread Lacanians. But that's much easier and less problematic, because sure, you can undo the scarecrow image. But what I don't think you can undo is the fact that to make a more coherent theory of composability between different fields, you need a different keyword that is not language, but is thinking. Like, I don't think that, I think that both pragmatically, for the simple fact that he does it, both conceptually, because it gives some reasons to why doing it, and also, just rhetorically, because it also looks very nice. You have the reasons to why the broader concept is thinking and not language. And my argument here about dependence and determination is just that usually when we want to resist this, the way that I did with regards to Lacan, my argument was very crude about, yeah, but there is no, these things cannot be thought without language. So I'm not trying to demote.
I think it's true.
Yeah, but it's not a strong argument. It's a weak argument.
No, I'm not saying it's like.
Yeah, my point is, if you want to throw light, if you want to throw light at the stuff he's saying, he's expanding the theory in order to fit into it. If you want to throw light into these subjective procedures, the way that he's talking about, he says this light is given by concepts such as idea, thinking, subject, and not by language. If you try to make a theory of the composability of procedures starting from the idea of language, you end up supposing things are more homogeneous amongst themselves than they are. So it's a different debate. It's not a debate about the legitimacy of the problems of analytic philosophy. It's a debate about the resistance to accept that a conditioned concept, such as thinking with regards to language, gives you a better view of the field than the thing that determines it or that it depends on. So to say that it depends on language, yeah, it's, you know, the Brazilian saying, it's raining on the wet. Yeah, sure, nobody said anything against this. But the fact is that when you take that perspective, you see less. So it's crazy that you can see more from a different perspective. I'm not sure about that. Yeah. But it's a different argument, and it has an affective issue. It has a habitual issue. It is an exercise in approaching things differently, but it's not about the legitimacy of the problem. So I just want to separate those two things and just say that the level of sophistication you have constructing the problems of analytic philosophy is totally different from the level of sophistication with regards to the argument, yeah, but there's no thinking without language, therefore language is prior. Because that's another argument.
Yeah, but now you're, yeah.
So
yeah, but now, now you're saying that I'm saying just that, I'm not saying just that, you know.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that
different.
What is at stake is not, since everything is, since all thinking is in language, or everything that we have is in language, therefore language is prior. I think that is an argument to face, but what is at stake is, what is the difference between definitional procedures and axiomatic procedures? I think that is,
yeah, this is incredible. Yeah,
that is the crux of the problem.
But guys, this, okay, is this too crude a version of that distinction? Again, sorry, but you know I have a compulsion. And I'm a vulgar thinking, so I think in vulgar.
Oh, please, drawing it again.
Yeah, like for me, definitional approach is something like this. I have language, so I can delimit objects, and I can define. Like, so it is about the priority of language and concepts for me to define after object.
No, I don't think, at least the way I understand it, I don't call it language.
How would you do it then?
I would say that definitional is just using a set of symbols and signs for inscription. You start by defining certain concepts. So there are concepts that you define using language of inscription. That is outside of this field of definition. That language, at that case, like what Badiou says, is just orthogonal. It's meta this field. It's just a series of symbols and methods of inscription in order to jot down something on a piece of paper. Okay, the language in this case, the way that I understand it, starts from the concepts and starts from the properties of those concepts, and then the operations between those concepts. Then that becomes the language.
Yeah, let me ask you something.
Okay, yeah. How would you guys rewrite this thing here?
Give me your pen. Give me your pen.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. Okay, Reza, you are thinking concepts like something akin to the rules of unfolding of certain symbols. Like you have a syntax and you have an algorithm.
Yeah, I have certain concepts, such as the concept of a number, let's say, or a concept of right. So I have, like Frege, I have the concept of an object. What is an object? An object is what is identical with itself. So I have a concept of identity. Every object has to be self-identifying. So this is like a basic concept.
So you provide certain definitions. Yeah.
Right, and you provide a definition.
Yeah.
Then so
I don't see a distinction between what I wrote.
Well, it's just the difference is just a methodological difference. What you call language, right? I call just a method of inscription.
Okay.
And that method of inscription you use no matter you inscribe an axiom or you inscribe a definition.
Yes, this is the point.
No, okay, so let's call it what, a syntax.
Right, right. For example, okay. I mean, this is just letters and symbols. That is all. So you can use that in order to inscribe axioms, or you inscribe definitions. So the difference starts whether you start from axioms or you start from definition, right?
Yeah.
So then another question that you are bringing up, I think, Gabriel, which is important, is let's say that we understand, let's say we read Lautzman and we read Frege, and then we said, okay, this is the difference between Lautzman and Frege. The discussion between Lautzman and Frege and Carnap would be the discussion between axioms and definitions, not the inscriptions. Then you have another discussion and saying, okay, Now we are using bunch of symbols and bunch of inscriptions in order to write definitions and in order to write axioms. Then what can we say about those inscriptions? What are those inscriptions? If they are meta, if they are outside of axioms and definitions, what are they, right? They are, and I think Badiou simply says they are signs. They are signs. They don't have any ontological status. They are signs for us in order to designate something. That's it.
Yeah, in a sense, you could say that this is language. Like you have the inscriptions, you can make definitions, you can make axioms. The layer of inscriptions would be, in this account, language. So it's not really, it doesn't have to do with being definitional or being axiomatic. You can be definitional or axiomatic within this, within the same milieu, so to speak. What I think is interesting is that there are reasons for him to choose axiomatics in ontology, because the concept of being so difficult to define, like something that general, that empty. So you just arrive at the presentation of presentation like something that can, in a sense, the manipulation of the symbols itself provides its own definition. So what I take to be the interesting thing that he's doing is like this coincidence between a certain unfolding of axioms, of a certain unfolding of rules that is coincident upon what it is doing. It's not defining something other than itself. But at the same time, in order for this to be accepted, as ontological, in a sense, he has to provide some kind of argument, and the argument has something to do with how special and how do you say, eccentric such a concept as being is, in a sense. Otherwise, I don't know, any inscription or any manipulation of symbols shouldn't count as ontology. So there is further reasons for that, right?
Yeah, because
Reza, can you just explain again to me? I mean, I totally agree with this, that like translating to the language that we use to debate this on, based on Mark and Lack and Church's reconstruction logical system. So sure, there's a mechanism of inscription called concatenation that is just the set of all symbols and possible formulas. There is the mechanism of formation, which is a partition of that, which only includes well-formed formulas. And within the set of all formulas, we have the field of derivations, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Theoremic derivations and things that you don't derive.
So in this case, the primitives are only signs. So
sure,
you have signs as primitives, and then you concatenate signs, and then formulation says that some concatenations are meaningful, some concatenations are not meaningful, or well-formed and not well-formed, and then derivation. Yes, that is absolutely
okay. Now it's within this, that it's within the field of, it's within this field here, below here, that the distinction between definitional and axiomatic will play.
Well, the definition, yes. So I would say yes, yes.
Okay, so I just want to understand what we're calling about the distinction, because my impression is that it concerns things like, well, I have this formal system here, it's well formed, and let's say from P, I can derive a series of statements, but I cannot derive these other statements.
Correct, based on either definitions or axioms.
Yeah, axioms is a strategy where you're allowed to add something here, that this, what you had plus this allows you to derive some new stuff.
Yes.
Right? Definition is a different way of defining the space. That is not by including an unmotivated statement that is only good because its motivation is that it allows you to derive new stuff.
Exactly.
So how do we define, what's the distinction?
And well, there are two distinctions here. One is that definitions are hierarchical, axioms are not hierarchical. So that is one difference. And the other difference is the difference that we spent a book to describe, which is the axiomatic approach is a pragmatic approach, is a consequence first,
Yes.
and then come back and revise your theory. Whereas definitional is theory first. Is the theory sound? Is the theory consistent? Is the theory robust? And then the consequences. So the primacy of practice over theory is what is inspiring the thinking of axiomatic. Whereas in the other field is the primacy of theory over practice. So that's why epistemology is such an important field in linguistics. Epistemology is a different field that investigates the soundness of your theory, whereas for axiomatic, there is no epistemology. Everything is inscribed within that field, which we call interiority. So these are two differences that
yeah, so that's why would you guys be okay with saying then, for example, if axiomatic is about adding something, because R becomes thinkable, the axiom is okay, right? You accept the axiom because of its consequence.
Yes, so you make the axiom in order for it to become thinkable.
Yes.
So for example, if you want to think the consistency of arithmetic, right?
Yes, exactly.
Then for the consistency of arithmetic, you have to assume a large cardinal, right?
Yes.
In order for arithmetic to be consistent, then you have to then you put an axiom that there is an uncountable cardinal, which is not countable by omega 1, which is the kappa cardinal, which makes arithmetic consistent. There is no way to prove or disprove that arithmetic is consistent or not. But
yeah, that's what I wanted to get at. Like, so definition would be to say, if I cannot derive R from P, so if this is not possible, I'm gonna go outside and ask, but what is P?
Right.
And
you don't go outside epistemologically. That is what one of my points was. You don't go outside epistemologically. You go within the field itself, right?
For the axiomatic or for the definition?
For the axiomatic.
Yes, that's the distinction I'm trying to make.
Oh, I see, okay.
So the definitional seems to me that, for example, Gödel shows that you cannot prove the consistency of arithmetic inside itself. A philosophical definitional approach is to then ask about what is number. The axiomatic approach is that, well, this means that you need to inscribe arithmetic into a larger system in order to make itself thinkable in its own terms.
Exactly. Like you have to assume that there is a larger than omega cardinal in order to make sure that arithmetic is consistent.
Yeah, so what is the concept of P? That's the, let's say, the definitional strategy. To move from the formal to the conceptual in order to delimit what can and cannot be done. Whereas the axiomatic says, okay, if you add certain stuff, some things become thinkable. Therefore, those are more imminent.
Now the problem of definition, you can already
have definition.
Sorry,
you can have definition as well. You just give a definition in terms of certain primitives. You have like primitives that are undefined, and then you define stuff with those primitives,
and vice versa,
Sorry, go on, Reza.
No, sorry.
What are you saying? Sorry.
I thought that you were finished. I'm saying you're absolutely correct that constructivist approach is absolutely an axiomatic approach. It's not that constructivists don't have axioms, right? the point is that what orientation are you taking in order to basically define the second point. The second point is how the field of investigation develops. So there is a concept of axioms and there is a concept of axiomatic thinking, right? It seems that these are two different concepts. So the fact that constructivists use axioms in order to basically, or the intuitionists in order to prove theorems and stuff like that is not debatable. They use axioms. But the way that Lautzman explains axiomatic thinking is that in this example that Gabriel provided, he got rid of it, is clearly showing the difference between definition and axiom is definition is hierarchical. You cannot come and all of a sudden.
This is a form of definition.
All of a sudden.
This is a form of definition. I agree.
Right. Add another definition, right, which is in contradiction with other definitions, or is not deriving from the basis of your system, which are your primitives. Whether in the case of axiomatics, the fact that you have constructivism and you have, say, realism or formalism is a clear example that you can have the axiom of infinity or not have an axiom of infinity, and you can continue your field of investigation and it doesn't bother anybody, right? So this is the main difference that Lautzman basically points out. So what is at stake, number one, is, I think there are two things at stake in our conversation. What is at stake is, what are the do's and don'ts in terms of axiomatic thinking versus definitional thinking and methods? I think this is one conversation which Gabriel is talking. And then another concept, I think, which is a more general discussion, is if we figure this thing out below this red line, that Gabriel has.
This one.
Right. So this is the discussion between Lautzman and Frege. Then the question, I think, another question that JP is asking is the stuff above the red line. Let's say that we have figured this thing out. What is the status of those signs and those concatenations? And what is the status of that? Are they falling under axiomatic thinking? Are they falling under definitional thinking? What is the status of that conversation?
Yes.
So there are two things at stake, I think, that we are discussing.
Yeah, I understand better now what you guys mean. Yeah. But just to make sure if I understand, if this makes sense to you guys as well, then what I'm writing here is that, let's say, rather than, there are two ways of determining if this axiom will be added. That's what the distinction between axiomatic and definitional. Is axiom accepted because of R, or is axiom accepted because of concept? Right? If you,
sure.
Yeah, because of P. So you see, I added here. So if you, the problem is not axiom. The problem is this outer movement necessary? It's definitional. Because you're going to the concept to accept. For example, the constructivist intuitionist approach, I cannot accept this axiom because it goes against the concept, which is the concept of computing or of processing mathematics. This concept is important for many other reasons. Why would I accept an axiom that makes R thinkable, but is in contradiction with my general theory of the world? Right? So the homogeneity you want to keep is at this place. This is where things need to be coherent. Right? The definitional wants to be coherent. Oh my God. At the level of the totality.
Right.
And the axiomatic wants to be coherent at the level of the interiority.
Right.
This is what determines if I'm accepting it or not. It's experimental in that sense. This other view is conceptual, because we only accept the axiom depending on our interpretation of what it means, how it relates to other stuff and things like this.
Right.
So what I think that is at stake in this debate is this possibility that things that look incoherent from the standpoint of the whole might reveal a new coherence from the standpoint of location. So local coherence will not be transitive with the global coherence. And it will just produce a problem for new philosophers, right?
There is no global coherence in axiomatic.
Exactly. We don't need it as a premise. Whereas in the definitional approach, that's what's guiding you all along.
Right.
That's what I call, let's say, well, a definitional or language-based approach, concept-based approach. It kind of guarantees a certain excessive homogeneity between the fields that the systems that it accounts for, because it is guided by a general coherence. Whereas the axiomatic doesn't guarantee it. It just gives problems to philosophers. Like, it's now your problem to find out how to make this coherent again, if so.
At the level of global, what is at stake for axiomatic thinking is compostibility.
Yes.
Okay, this is interesting. Yeah.
So I think that's the first point, right? And I think that the way Badiou uses Gödel's theorems in Mark and Lack to distance himself from the linguistic term. He says, Frege, like from the logicist approach, you guys fall under this whole problem, which is, oh my God, some statements are not derivable about arithmetic from arithmetic. You need a broader system to interpret it, otherwise these things cannot be, they're truth, but they are not provable. You suddenly have a coherence problem, and you need, it affects, it's a philosophical problem. But Gödel solved it mathematically. It's a logical problem. He says, I'm interested in the logical machinery, and philosophy of language was interested in the conceptual machinery that derived from it, not necessarily realizing that it wasn't really a problem, something like this. I mean, I just want to make sure that at least this distinction is clear. My point is that, okay, if we mix this problem with the issue of how this connects to this, right? The argument that, oh, but this is not axiomatic. Like, okay, at this level, perhaps axiomatic is kind of, I don't know how to distinguish it from definition. Like, if I use these symbols rather than others, if well-formed formulas are based on these symbols rather than others, and so on, where is axiomatics here? How can it be more general, right? And I don't think that that's what Badiou is worried about. Like, I don't think there's absolutely no problem for him.
No, yeah. I think that the field of, I mean, thinkability, intelligibility is below that red line.
Yes. He calls this the field of production.
Right. This is the above the red line is not the realm of intelligibility. So,
but for example, nothing prevents. Yeah, but nothing prevents there existing a field that studies, let's say, alphabets, the history of language, the history of.
Sure.
That suddenly realizes that a new idea will help us to understand why these systems were accepted rather than these ones. Right? I mean, linguistics itself is not very correct to say that it is definitional in itself. Philosophy of language might take this distinction, this approach, but let's say scientific theories of language don't take this approach.
Actually, neuroscience or biology may be interested. I'm saying
that philosophy of language takes this approach. I think traditional philosophy takes this approach. I mean, the definitional one. I think what is pit against Badiou here is traditional ontology, is not really analytic philosophy. This is one of my points, I think. Some analytic philosophy, yes, but not every kind of analytic philosophy. But, you know, traditional philosophy, like big, philosophical theory, usually starts from definitions. And, you know, one of the weird things about being an event is that it doesn't start with a definition of being really a definition. It's like you have a bunch of axioms and yeah, let's think of ontology like this. At least I read it more like this than, you know, I'm proving to you that mathematics is ontology. There's no reason.
It doesn't need
proof, really. No. There are good reasons for it, interesting reasons for it, In this I defend Badiou. I mean, there are interesting reasons for it, but there is no proof like, oh, okay, you know, this is the most general concept of being that there is. It's most empty, perhaps, because it's almost like the manipulation of science itself. But you know, anyway, and there is a meta philosophical interpretation of this that, you know, gives further reasons. This is kind of interesting. But let me give you an example. For instance, I've been reading, because of Badiou, we've been reading Logics of Worlds. It's kind of a framework for dealing with appearances and all of that. So there is the Nelson Goodman book that is called The Structure of Appearance. Basically the same thing. And what is interesting in this book is that it is a phenomenalistic system, in that it tries to kind of, it has some interesting points in common with Badiou, but it's a phenomenalistic system that tries to construct objects out of appearances, like phenomena. This is a phenomenalistic system, right? And it does it, what I find interesting, that it does it through what he calls something that he devises in the book, that is called a calculus of individuals. So it's a nominalistic system and a phenomenalistic system. He wants to provide a nominalistic version of, you know, the Carnap's alpha or something like that. And if you ask him why, you know, it's kind of, yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, you know, the result is what matters in a sense. He says, you know, it's more economic. It's all the opposite of Badiou in the sense of the objective, right? Like what Goodman wants is the most economic, you know, ontological landscape, the minimal ontological commitments possible, and all that. So he substitutes, he replaces like operations like intersection for overlapping. So a class of things, a class of appearances, he will think of it as an individual, even an individual that is scattered in time and space. Like the individual, the class of horses, there's the individual horse that is scattered in time and space. So, I mean, I'm telling you all of this because, you know, it's kind of difficult to understand, you know, Goodman, like, as a definitional kind of approach. He's completely reversing every, you know, every kind of intuitive, pre-theoretical understanding in order to see what it would entail to replace classes for individuals, you know. And I'm not sure if there is really that big difference right there. I think the definition, the idea of axiomatic thinking against a definitional system, it seems to have a presupposition that the definitional system is based upon a commonsensical understanding of language. This is what I'm getting at. Whereas somebody like Nelson Goodman is trying to completely remake all the calculus, all the language, what he thinks is a language, in order to see the results. I want to see what this world will look like with this calculus of individuals, a phenomenalistic system that is a nominalist system, not a platonist, a nominalist system. So is this definitional in this sense? In what sense is he appealing to previous intuitions or to a stable picture of language, like a stable picture of language that is already in use?
Well,
of course, it appeals to it because you have to have. Sorry, go on.
What you're describing is that Nelson Goodman is a self-proclaimed linguist, but as a matter of fact, he is doing axiomatic system.
Yeah, this is a possible answer.
He's basically developing a discipline within his probably exploring or creating a new discipline by providing very, very basic preliminary signposts that we call axiom, and then let the thinking just go wild in that field, which we call that an interiority, which call that an intellectuality or whatever, right? So he may believe that he's a linguist because he's doing this about a language, but as a matter of fact, he's a disciplinary. He's an axiomatic disciplinary. I wanted to.
Yeah, I don't know. For me,
actually, I wanted Gabriel, if you can put your picture up. The interesting question for me is now we have established the stakes that we have below the line and above the line, and I think we mentioned, and I agree with this, that Badiou really is, in Mark and Lack, he describes the above the line and below the line, but when he speaks about axiomatic thinking and he actually gets involved in ontology and phenomenology, he's more or less talking about stuff below the line, right? The question is there any relationship between, two questions. What is the status of what is above the line and the below the line, right? So that is what I think we said, which is the primacy of language. That is another question. But the other question that I have aside from that is the stuff above the line, which is the field of automation, right? Or what you called production. Is there an emergence or a relationship between what is above the line and below the line? And I think that is what I think the way Zizek is criticizing Badiou. So for Badiou takes intelligibility as an axiom, that there is something as thinking. And Zizek is questioning, why is there thinking? And where does this thinking come from? And for him, thinking is equal to subjectivity. And also, this is Negarestani's question, that how from the stuff above the line, all of the sudden stuff from below the line, regardless if it is axiomatic or definitional, can emerge, yes. Right? So I think this is something that Badiou does not have.
I disagree.
Yes, this is the point.
You disagree? It's interesting. I like to hear.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different thinkers within this tradition that deals with exactly this kind of thing, like the rule-following paradoxes of Wittgenstein. They are not about, definition. They're about what it is, what does it mean to go on the same way about anything? What's the criteria of this? Like, mm-hmm. This is a very, very foundational question, and it has something to do with concatenation, formation, like all of the stuff that are the conditions for having definition, for having axioms, for having all
of the here more complex. The passage from this to this concerns use, rules.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sure.
So this is where
coming from. Right.
Like, can I just propose the opposite?
Sure.
Which is again, I began as a Zizekian, so for me, that was the great thing. Like,
that was Zizek.
Somebody's trying to kill themselves. Sure. My point is the following, and again, pay attention to the fact that in the middle of the argument, you need to demote something that we care a lot about to accept the other argument. Okay, which is. Here you have extrinsic, but for example, his position with regards to what's on top here is, look, there are many reasons why these things will be formed the way they will. It says, for example, the history of concatenation is connected with the theory of the production of alphabets. You can go into that theory, but I'm not in the condition to discuss that at the same time that I talk about the coherence of logical systems.
Yep.
So, no, of course not.
No, not of course not. Because the conditions for the intelligibility of the history and science of concatenation might be incoherent with the intelligibility of logical systems. They might be at different stages. They might require different tools, different commitments. I don't want to say that they need to be coherent just because one thing depends on the other. The way
but there is a field that they are dependent. And that field is the field of AI. What is machine learning?
Sure,
What
sure.
what are
Look,
the conditions?
just
Okay,
sure.
go ahead.
My
But
point
you know
is
my
just that,
question then.
yes, I know. My point is just that, and I think Hegel is really important here, which is, why did Hegel criticize mathematics? Because he was clear that there is some externality, exteriority here. These things are not related to themselves in the same way that mathematical concepts are related to themselves. Mathematical science, he said, are too exterior in their relations. Like they could have other relations for all I care. So my point is that, for example, I think that it's much more coherent with Badiou's approach to say the following. Surely there is a relation between this and theirs, that is, for example, causal, constraining, so on and so forth. But
generative,
all of that. In the same way that the history of biology and the evolution of cells, evolution of organisms is a condition for this as well. But to expect that there is a thinking that will cover homogeneously all these approaches, this is philosophy trying to remain the reigning thinking. Let's say you only thought things truly if you thought them philosophically. And I think Zizek does this, like psychoanalysis does this, to assume that if I want to think this, I need to give the correct thinking of this. So the idea that, for example, neuroscience will understand our relation to writing or to decision making or whatever. So, but what Badiou says is that, look, for some, and this reappears afterwards in Being an Event, this remains, let's say, at a certain level before the count as one, right? The count as one of a system happens from the passage from this to this. This is just a mess. I don't know why this happens the way that it does. I know that I can close a system in such a way that I can evaluate if I use P or if I add this axiom based on its interiority. And this will give me, let's say, immanent measure of what is good and what is not, how to approach. Philosophy, because it, let's say, philosophy accepts that philosophical thinking, insofar as it tries to think all these things together, it's immanent enough. And Badiou is saying, no, you should wait, because probably there will be some scientific approach that will come up with a formal system that accounts for these things at some point. Like, there's no reason to assume that you need to give a generative, complete picture in order to understand a fragment. And I think that this means that philosophy must wait. It should approach things that think themselves, but it should not, let's say, trust too much when it gives the only thinking of those things. So if we don't have a theory of concatenation information that is thought immanently, where these concepts arrive inside here, the relation between P and Q, I will call concatenation. If you have a brain like this and some tools, you develop alphabet in this way. God knows, I don't know. It will say, I'm aware of, let's say, conceiving immanence as a philosophical thing, where if it's coherent in a philosophy, then it was thought truly. I think that he's okay with leaving things in a messy state that I extract interiorities from, in the supposition that there will be an interior thinking of these things if there isn't already. So I think that this translates, in a certain sense, into a distinction between, again, it brings the definitional back in the axiomatic, because, for example, you could rewrite what we just said about a formal system where some things are derivable, some things are not derivable, and you need to add something else to it, so that from this perspective, now R is derivable, right? If you go through this new field here, this is derivable. This is what mathematics, modeling theory, they're worried about. What are the actual practices of expanding a field so that I can now say more stuff about the place I came from?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, but let me give you probably not a counter example, but let's say counter example. So let's even be more finer grain. Let's say that we have concatenation, formation, and what was the last one?
Derivation.
Derivation. Let's map them loosely to 3 levels. One is the level of lifeless, life, and then intelligibility, right? So the pure one, the first one is concatenation. It's just a bunch of molecules just attached with each other in the universe, and basically there is no purpose, and then all of a sudden certain concatenation creates a formation of proteins, and some of these proteins become more stable, and some proteins become less stable, and the more stable proteins remain, right? So it's all of a sudden it seems that we have a field, right? We have a field that's called biology or evolution theory that describes a generative process from the first level to the second level.
Yes.
Right? Now the question is, I'm not saying that there must be a generative process, and there hasn't been yet a generative process, how to go from life to intelligibility, right? There hasn't been yet. There is a lot of a struggle, both philosophy and science, in order to describe how life becomes consciousness or self-consciousness. But because of the move from the first level to the second level, there is a tendency to think that there is a move from the second level to the third level as well. So while I understand that each level has its own rules of intelligibility or domains of intelligibility, which is different. I mean, the domain in which, like the book that you have shared with us, the Rosen book, the domain of intelligibility for understanding minerals, which is in the first level, is different than the domain of intelligibility for living organisms, which is in the second level, right? But there is a different domain of intelligibility that we call evolution, biology or evolutionary theory, that says in these conditions or in these circumstances, then you have a different domain that goes across the two, right? Mm-hmm. And if we follow the same kind of heuristics, same kind of history of thought, it is not inconceivable to think that there should be a fourth level of intelligibility that describes the same way that shows a generative process from minerals to organisms. Then there is a move from organisms to intelligibility, right? And that is, I think, what Zizek is trying to say. Zizek, with his non-orientables and things like that, he's trying to create that field of intelligibility that describes how we can think of intelligibility, something like a subjective intelligibility that describes the move from, it is not mixing, it's not creating a hierarchy of intelligibilities. It's just a different level of intelligibility. If it's a different domain of intelligibility. You know what I'm saying?
No, I think I understand what you're saying, but so would you agree with this? Like, say, the tendency is to assume that because this is more general than this, and this came before this, right? Lifeless or concatenation, what is well-formed or what is living, and then what is derivable or intelligible, right?
Yeah, yeah, it seems, yes.
Yeah, and you can say there is something like a movement like this.
There seems to be a movement like this.
Yeah, okay. My point is that if I were to add Badiou's response to this, is to say, Okay, but inside of the derivable, there will be the derivability of C, the derivability of F, the derivability of D, which will actually be multiple for him, right? And that one thing is for thinking to understand that it's working here, even if it's grasping these things outside, right? Actually, let's say the crazy thing about this inner thing is that it's not really inside, so it's actually a weird topology, where at the same time that this is the case, it's also the inverse. The intelligibility is the big one.
Exactly.
And
yeah, of course.
But inside the derivability, these things are not organized chronologically. They are organized like this. There is a field that studies this, a field that studies this, things like this.
And there is another way to show them completely separately, like following Rosen.
Yeah, so my point is that there is a derivability about the history of concatenation. It will have to include something about the history of formation. It needs to be composable with it, but it's not necessarily the same approach that will give us this. Then there is a history of the derivability of logical systems and the history of derivability of whatever, right? So what I think is the difference, and that's why I say that the argument requires you to change your habits with regards to philosophy, is that philosophers like to think that they are outside of this, looking at all these things from one same coherent perspective. That's why I meant the idea of emergence. And well, if this thing depends on this thing, that depends on this thing, the correct approach is one where if dependence, then precedence, intellectual precedence. You can be very sophisticated with how you organize these things, but it's always a philosophical thing because nobody's thinking this way, only we are. Whereas everyone else operates in this way. So this above approach gives philosophy a very special place in giving you a history of intelligence. And this approach here gives philosophy a very humble place of having to deal with these things that don't rely on philosophy. So that's my point. That like not even linguists use language the way that we use in philosophy. Not even linguists use life in the way, not even biologists use life in the way that we use in philosophy. Nobody uses these concepts in these ways. In order to make this general approach coherent for us, we need to, let's say, monopolize the definition of the true use of this stuff. General theory of use, general theory of norms, general theory of whatever. Badiou doesn't want a general theory of anything. He wants a theory where philosophy comes afterwards and says, if these guys did this and did this and did this, what the hell is the composability of these things?
But can we, following what you said, I agree with what you are saying, that would be Badiou's, a Badiouian framework or Badiouian way of thinking about this problem. That was why I was trying to frame my question in that way, to fit into the Badiouian kind of framework. That let's say that one of these red things at the bottom is the movement from C to F, right? So that is a completely different field of investigation. It's not hierarchical. It's not saying, so one of these fields says, what are the practical ways in which we think that dumb concatenation can bring a sort of intelligent formation, like meaningful formation. And in this case, meaningful means persistence in nature, right? Yeah. Like radioactive material is not persistent in nature, whereas, I don't know, elements in the lower section of the Mendeleev table.
Just a question, are we recording? Like, it's blinking now, the recording button. The red thing.
It says here it's recording.
Okay. I never saw it blink like this. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Here it says recording.
Yeah. So
sorry, yes, to conclude, sorry.
nothing. I was just saying that I am framing my question. I think if I understood your diagrams or legends properly, I was trying to frame my question more within that red region rather than the purple region, which was more hierarchy and more philosophical language and more like a kind of Aristotelian approach from bottom up or top to bottom or whatever.
Yeah, the reason why I'm saying this is just the following. Like, let me just add these things here again, as we said. Here, my hypothesis, what I'm trying to suggest to you guys is that to add philosophy here, you kind of need a certain, I find it very hard, kind of unconvinced that it's so common. It's very hard not to have something like the world here on top and something like concepts here. We're describing this thing here, right? Whereas here, what you get is what Badiou wants. So in this point here, I think you tend to have something like the world and you're mapping it into your system or whatever, like concepts. Whereas here, what you actually get, in my impression, is that why is this interior? Because this thing it knows something at a certain point, then you develop new ideas and it tells you more about this, then it develops new ideas, tell you more about this, meaning that the first thing is formal and the second thing is also formal. Like, you don't get the idea of world out there in this general sense. Right? And I think that this is what Badiou wants an ontology for, how things can immanently model themselves without the philosophical division between world and concept. I'm describing the world as is. He doesn't want an ontology for our world, for how appearances appear in our world. Right. So all of this to get back to the book, because what are Heiting algebras and these things? They do for appearance what set theory did for
we got to kind of strayed away from our reading completely.
Yeah, my point is, like, what did we see in the case of being an event?
So
we're very close to it. I think this is very, very, very important. Like, it goes back to the article Caron and I want to write. Like, why is being an event an interesting approach? It simply says, look, man, if I have a set of whatever, I can define language or functions or predication in a homogeneous way, as we were discussing, right? I mean, if I have alpha and beta here, I can only have 4 subsets that basically describe all possible functions from this to this. All possible ways I can create predicates. This will be what they will distinguish, no other way, right? This means basically that I can define belonging through, define inclusion from belonging. To be included in a I don't need anymore to distinguish between worlds and language. My theory of language is totally included in my ontology, right? The basic description is that I don't have sets and I have languages like this, separate like this. What I have are sets, and power sets and languages are here. They're not heterogeneous to my model. Right? Heiting algebras allow you to do the same thing, but for a measure, for evaluation. I have a multiple, a world, I have a transcendental inside that world, and now I can talk about the relation between stuff that is here and how close these things are together, as if I'm talking about this thing and something inside of itself. I don't need this added field here of language. Language is here.
Yeah.
That's all Heiting algebra does. It immanentizes the basic operations of language in the world that you're talking about. That's why, let's say, it's that's what the distinction, the whole debate between definitional and axiomatic means, in my opinion, in terms of strategy. One thing is to say, I have something, I want to know what is allowed and what not allowed. One thing is for me to have to go this way and ask about concepts that are defined separately. Another thing is when I have something, rather than go this way, I look for something inside of it that relates to itself. Right? This is what we're calling axiomatic. And this is what we're calling definitional. So
I know what you mean, but I would make a slight, the fact that transcendental is part of a world is not an axiom. It's a consequence of the formalization. What is axiomatic? So I know what you are saying, but my my example would be different. So I'm not saying transcendental is because we put an axiom that every word has a transcendental. We are saying every word has a transcendental because this is the consequence of our formalization of every word. What is an axiom is that there is no whole. This is an example of the axiom.
Okay.
That,
yeah, no, I think it's ultimately the same, which is to
ultimately
say,
the same. I just
there is no
example.
whole here. There is no place
Right.
I can always refer to judge how things appear.
Right.
The only universal process is to locally judge.
Right.
And then the question becomes, is there a thinking, is there a formalism, is there a language for how you locally judge stuff?
Right. So the way I actually wrote this in a note that I published last week about phenomenology and formalism, that speaks to some of the stuff that JP was talking about. That again, I think we repeated here that Badiou never says that Heyting algebra is something that is inscribed in the words. He never says that. He never says that each field of phenomenon is like. He's saying that if we want to think about phenomenology and think of it in a formalized way, exactly the same way that we did with ontology, the way to formalize it, the way that I suggest we formalize it, is by relying on Heyting algebra. And why Heyting algebra? Why not set theory? Because in set theory, identity was through the operation of equivalence, whereas in phenomenology, identity is through the operation of comparison. That's all.
Identity is relative to phenomenology.
Right. So that is all. That is all he's saying.
I think there is a fruitful comparison to be made with, for instance, historical phenomenology, like Husserl, this kind of thing. Like, it seems to me that Gabriel has in mind something like the Husserlian version of this, in a sense. Like, I want to make an investigation on appearances. So how do I go about this? I will bracket the existence of things around me, and through some method of introspection to kind of abstract their eidos, their essences, their structure. Some stuff is temporal, some stuff is spatial. Normally the spatial object is integrated to different adumbrations that are temporally, firstly, I lived differently than integrated and all of that. So there you have both a subjective kind of phenomenology that aims to be apodictic, so it aims to be objective in the end. But the methodology is through introspection, like a kind of introspection, and also a transcendent phenomenology is aiming at different idealities, different objects, different like material objects or mathematical idealities. And through this method of introspection, you get to localize them in different regional ontologies or something like this, right? So in the Husserlian sense, it seems to be like to have this constitutive relationship to an outside. This is what Gabriel was talking about, right? Like you have to look at things and see what they are, and you have a method of bracketing their appearances, their phenomena, and then you can categorize them into regional ontologies and all that. So in a sense, I think this is interesting. And the phenomenon, the Badiou's version basically goes on about like beginning with the non-all and then defending degrees, the idea of transcendental degrees, basically. So I can see I think the difference is well, it behaves well for these two examples, really. Husserl, like traditional phenomenological approach by Husserl, and objective phenomenology by Badiou. I think this is clear for these examples. But there are things like they are kind of ambiguous as well. I return to Nelson Goodman, for instance. I was talking about this book, The Structure of Appearance. It seems there is a kind of I don't know. There is what you guys are calling a certain interiority. He's trying to test certain ideas about the nominalistic way of constructing entities, objects out of appearances, and all of that. But after this whole phase, this was his PhD thesis in the 30s and 40s. Then it became this book that was published in 1951. And then after this, he goes on to the idea like in the 70s of world making. So he comes to this idea that, oh, there's no world, there's no pre-existing world. We are making worlds all the time. So this is his most forceful thesis in a sense. And this was a whole debate and there was a whole difficulty with this, because then it kind of begs the question about, okay, the idea is you can, if you ask how the world is, and you try to bracket every different theoretical framework you have, or phenomenological framework, or intuitive framework, whatever you have for getting there, you will get nowhere. So his conclusion is, we are always making worlds, and there is compossibilities and incompossibilities and all of that. It is very similar in a sense to the result of these logics of worlds. But there was nevertheless this debate about how about the referent? Like how about, in a sense, you are constructing worlds, in a sense, these kind of different local totalities, let's call it like that, like it's kind of an oxymoron, but anyway, this kind of local totalities, there are frameworks that inform the way we move about. But what is the relationship between these interiorities and, you know, stuff outside, in a sense? So this is this idea that there is no world. It seems that we have to understand it in a certain metaphorical sense. We don't have a world in the sense that we don't have a coherent system of the world. We may have stuff going on that we don't understand. So we have scientific theories, philosophical systems, works of art. He wrote a lot about art. He wrote a lot about making alphabets. This is very interesting. There's a whole chapter, The Theory of Notation in Languages of Art, a book about symbol systems that takes art as a domain of inquiry about the formation of symbolic systems. There is a whole chapter about alphabets that we were mentioning. So there is still a question about, you know, in a sense, let's say the representational purpose of all of that. You don't have Aristotelian adequacy. You don't have like a given in that sense, because you have to, these things get made. You are saying like axiomatically, like we choose certain things and get some results and all of that. And their field of inquiry, in a sense, is unfolding and suggesting also certain options, right? But at the same time, we want to understand the relationship between these interiorities and this stuff out there that's going on.
But look, this is the I think I find a way to move towards what you guys are saying that is a bit more yeah, the emergentist is widespread in the scientific community, but even in biology, it's also questionable. I mean, we can go into that, but okay. My point is just the following. I would assume that the best of analytic philosophy is has the same exact ambition as Badiou. That's not what's at stake. This is what I mean by problems remain, interesting ideas remain. What I think changes, and me for my part, I have a hard time not reading this into the guys in analytic philosophy that I read, and either positively or as a hindrance at some point. So this is the basic thing that I think applies, according to Badiou, it applies both to phenomenology and to certain strands of analytic philosophy, which is to say, you begin with this distinction between world, which is a sort of black box, and language. So this is something like this. And you want to know about this stuff here. Reference and language systems and so on and so forth. And then the heterogeneity is here and philosophy is here. And we can accept that there are multiple languages and that they refer to multiple stuff and that the theory of connecting them is a third thing. No problem there.
The stuff on the left is what? The stuff on the left?
Here, it's world.
Oh, world, okay.
Out there.
Stuff. Sounds like stuff, yeah.
The state of affair.
Yeah, something like that.
State of affairs, yeah.
How is this distinct? What I think is a very small change that doesn't change most of the ambitions and the ideas, but it just adds a twist. I have a hard time stretching the idea of language to mean both the process of naming and the existence of the referent to which it names. Like, that's why language, like, even in a common sense, but also in very technical terms, it is an object or a concept or a field or whatever you want to call that has some stakes on the idea that names and things are different, and then we want to see in which way names are also things, in which ways things constrain names. But that distinction between presentation, what is presented, what presents, and representation
is inherent within the...
I totally agree that there are analytic philosophers that want to question this, but they're questioning kind of against their own principles. Like, they become paradoxical, they become counterintuitive, they become heretics, and so on and so forth. What is Badiou suggesting? That there is a very precise, small cluster of ideas in certain random contingent places, like mathematics, where we can get the relation between world and language as part of the theory. The theory has both poles, world and language, formal system and model, set and post set, and power set, sorry. Or even in the case here, because inclusion has a very strict relation to order structuring. So it actually goes for transcendentals as well. But anyway, those two things are inside the same. And it's philosophy that it's here. Right? There is a theory where these two things are, there is no black box on this side, heterogeneous with this side. This is actually both homogeneous formally. That's what's interesting. Why set theory? Well, because it thinks presentation and representation with the same formal tools. Why Heiting's algebra? Because we haven't gotten there yet. From what we've seen thus far, we actually have a multiple and a transcendental, and we saw something like this arrow. And we're kind of weirded out about how this concerns it, right? what the chapter on the object is going to do is show us how this relates back to the structure of this in a homogeneous way with no black boxes, right? So Badiou says, look, language here is a general approach that it requires some level of distinction, some basic level that very vulgarly I'm going to call between names and things. You can be very sophisticated about this, but if this is your primitive idea on how to move towards philosophy, you're going to have to deal with this distinct heterogeneity that you produce. Thinking is, since Parmenides, a problem where thinking itself and being, they have a more intrinsic relation. Like thinking for Badiou means pay attention not to the distinction between names and things, but to how a process constitutes the thing it talks about. Those two things are together, right? You see, this is what he searches in stuff. Exactly what this idea here is precisely this idea here. So he's substituting language for thinking as the primitive concept of how you move from different processes to philosophy. What he's doing is adding something to language. He's saying language plus the local relation between these two things. But you don't want to call that language. That's not what we call language. That's not what anyone calls language. So why call it language? Just to stick with the same concept. So thinking is just the operator that rather than adding, like rather than respecting, let's say, bringing together different systems based on their languages, you bring together different systems based on their thinking. What have you gained? You gained the suspension of this heterogeneous stuff, because thinkings are precisely processes that model themselves. They construct their own languages out of their presentations. They have their own representations for their own presentation. It's a, let's say, you added something, right? You removed this stuff here. You made this intelligible. You're saying that the relation between language and reference is local as well. There is no general theory of this stuff. That's what he's doing. He's just accepting, let's say, he's just, rather than, let's say, privileging logics, formal logic, which is allows to do this with languages, he's selecting stuff that has one condition, that the referent and the reference are both inside the same process. So ZFC allows for this, locally allows for this. So these are better tools. And you no longer has the heterogeneity here. You open that black box. Now you can say, but I can still ask the question, like my philosopher, he was previously a bit embarrassed with the problem of how do you account for the outer world? What is the relevance of world making to actual worlds, right? And you would have to give some, the very form of the problem is defined by the concept that you chose, by your first move, which was to espouse language as this primitive organizer of the field. When Badiou says that thinking is the prime organizer of this whole operation of how you move from philosophy and back, he has a completely different answer. He says, you have a hard time understanding this on the real world because you're here doing fucking philosophy. If you were there near politics, near art, you would see how these things relate to the world. It just doesn't relate to the world, which is actually a, let's say, a secretion of this primitive concept, right?
Like in a sense, thinking is like a cluster that brings together, you know, language and the world within the process.
Exactly,
like
that's it. That's it. That's it. That's the only difference.
Yeah.
But then
so you change a certain distinction for a cluster that mixes both, and this mixture actually makes intelligible a different thing. Then
yeah, and my point is, it gives you a certain healthy position, which you already explored in other comments, which is, I will not accept a language without a reference. I don't accept language that doesn't quantify over a specific domain. So it seems like it's a restriction because you added something, but it's actually, let's say, a maximalization because it now includes the domain. It doesn't accept the concept of language that doesn't come with some domain definition. So I don't accept norms that don't have domains. And here you can get entangled into this because if you have a general theory of norms, you should have a general theory of reference as well. And then you're fucked. So the ambition is the same, but everything changes with this move because this line here is removed. You don't have this as a essentialist qualification that you are struggling with because you inherited it from modern philosophy or whatever. You removed it. And the relation between a thinking and the world is transformed into the, well, to think a thought, which is a sort of strange iteration approach that you get, is to learn the domain in which those norms apply. You need to know both to know a norm. There is no sense of knowing norms in general. So I don't, this is my point, like you can keep all the ambitions from this stuff here, because he's treating the same problem. This big problem here becomes this problem here. That's easier to accept. And when you talk about this, you like it very much. I can see it in your face. The thing that you don't like is substituting this for this.
Yeah, because I think thinking is such an obscure notion that I don't think it clarifies much.
Sure, but my point is that, that's what I said about Cassin, that Cassin, it was a good example of how she thinks she's closer to the real, to the empirical, to the obvious with language rather than with thinking, but she cannot define domains. And she's stuck. The relativists, the linguistic term, they're stuck because they bar themselves of answering a question, whereas with thinking, which is obscure, etc., this answer is, you can give the answer. Like, oh, but how is mathematics related to the world? You can laugh at the person because, dude, what this guy did is related to what the other guy did in mathematics. That's how it's related to the world. It's related to the world of mathematics. Like, it's not an abstract thing, it's a concrete thing. But how is art related?
Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's a legitimate question. For instance, we are debating a lot about how use examples in logics of world are bad, or the blue bird thing and all that. So this it's there in the background all the time. Like, how does this apply? Of course, applying might be a bad word. It's not application. You're not applying the framework really, since you are defining it to be immanent. But in a sense, it's difficult to recognize them. I can change the vocabulary, not say applying, but recognize. It's difficult to recognize the transcendental within a concrete situation, subjective that I live, or there's some difficulty. There was some difficulty in providing an example from David Lean's filmography that we wanted to provide with this machinery. I think there's something there to be done.
Yeah, sure, but
so there is I think there is a legitimate, it's not a legitimate question, because I don't want to say to you that there is a problem with this account. This is too much to say that there is a problem. I'm not sure that there is a problem, but there is a legitimate suspicion. That is, the suspicion is maybe you are just postponing the problem of the relationship between the formalism and the stuff out there.
Sure,
you resolve this within a practice, and then there is the question. Okay, so you have this cluster that is thinking, and how does this cluster that is immanent, that is modeling itself, how does it maps different stuff that is not interior to the discipline, in a sense? Or if this even makes sense, maybe that doesn't make sense within this framework.
But I totally agree.
Something lacking.
But look, evidently there are problems with the book. What I'm trying to say is that these are problems based on this. You need to ask questions based on this grammar of thinking, not on this grammar of thinking. While you don't accept that this is the grammar of the stuff.
But you know, you have to be more nice to me in a sense, because the question of representation comes about because, in a sense, I have the model of language to appeal to. So maybe thinking wants to break completely with the model of representation. Okay, Deleuze tries to do the same thing. Okay,
yeah, he's fine. Not doing this, but okay.
This is yeah, of course. If this is the goal, okay, but it doesn't seem to be the goal. It seems to be, okay, you're substituting one thing for another, and then you have now an homogeneous domain wherein model and the models are in the same equal footing, so to speak. It's not heterogeneous anymore. But how does this modeling relationship projects upon things that are not within the modeling relationship? So there you reinstate a problem of representation again. You know? And I think this is a legitimate, and I'm being precise about this. This is a legitimate suspicion. I'm not saying that.
Okay, no, but
it's maybe too soon to say, oh, okay.
No, but this is a great issue. No, this is a crucial problem. But again, the only thing I'm trying to suggest is that I find that it's very weak the way that Badiou describes. Let's say he's very unconcerned with this question of, but how does this relate to the world? And I think that he has this sort of underlying condescension, I don't know how to say it, that people asking wrong questions are just wrong. You don't correct them or don't lead them. He just says this makes no sense in my system. But I do think that there is a lot of writing, and there is it's because of this precise problem that he then writes books on each condition, and that these need separate treatments and things like this. Because the problem that you have here is a problem of application. Let's say, this is what will embarrass us when we adopt this position. Because you just described me a picture of this whole thing, and I want to know how I introduce back this thing that was left behind here, the world. So this is the movement, right? The movement in this approach here, since the world was already included here formally, right? What we actually get is the other, a very different problem that Sylvain Lazarus names very well, which is how to think what people think. So I axiomatically decide this.
Okay. How to think what people think? Can you flesh this out a bit?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. So
what's the meaning of this question?
Yeah. So my point is, axiomatically, our ontology is saying there is such a thing as immanent modeling. There are immanent modeling, which is thinking, right? There are thoughts. I don't know if they are happening now, if they're happening somewhere, but I can prove that this such a thing is thinkable. Now, I don't know where this happens, who is doing it, if somebody's doing it or not, but I can assume that people are thinking stuff, at least in principle. Now, the question is, how do you relate in the world to this sort of process, right? And Badiou says that the passage here is the inverse. That's why, again, I kind of hammered a lot on the point that the subject comes before the formal theory, because the problem is the inverse. The problem is people are doing stuff. Some of this stuff is considered irrational, autistic, fanatic, because it's not transcribable into a general framework. And Badiou is saying it is thinkable that they are thinking stuff. There where you say that there is no relation between what they're doing in the real world, I can prove that it's thinkable that there is a relation. Now, what is that relation? In which terms it happens? I already showed that it's immanent. I cannot tell beforehand. So the question no longer is, how do I apply in the world? Because application implies the heterogeneity. But the question is, what is the regime of modeling that is going on there? Yeah. Right? Well, and he says, well, you can check by going there. Inquiries, investigation, empirical, engagement, things like this. So,
yeah, you know, I like this a lot. You're right, but at the same time, I can't avoid thinking that once I get there, all the problem of language and representation will be reinstated.
But I can give you a very simple answer as to why that's not the case. I can give you a very simple answer. Like, and I think Badiou was a genius at this. He said in 1982, I think he was in this meeting with Lacoue-Labarthe, Claude Lefort, all those guys who thought about the political. And his point was, guys, I agree with you that language is equivocal. It can mean a lot of stuff. But you know, if you go to a factory and see what people are doing, if you're engaged in the work, you will learn the use of those terms. That question is this, it only is posable from this sort of outside view where it's posed in its general form and politics doesn't refer to anything. Like, his point is, the problem becomes a problem about domains and references. It becomes a Wittgensteinian problem of use. When you go there, from outside, it's a problem of representation. From close by, it's a problem of pragmatic.
You're describing something like, like he would answer like it's a problem of form of life in the sense of Wittgenstein line.
Yeah, but you see, look, and that's my point. Look,
like this, and they have a understanding.
Yeah, everything we gained here in this upper view, it's preserved. So if we have gained a lot with Wittgenstein here and a theory of use and so on, we'll still find the same validity here. It's just not here in philosophy. You just need to go there. You know, people are practical Wittgensteinians, not theoretical ones. Like, it's up to us philosophers to debate forever. What do people mean by the word wages or factory?
And what more, I think, is important, what more is what circumscribes that form of life is not the language itself.
Yes,
it's
because the language will be
engagement. Here. Right.
Yeah, and
so
see,
what
I mean,
right. So what circumscribes is because then aside from the logical problem of circularity, for Badiou, it is that thinking, that problem, what is at stake, that circumscribes a field of engagement, a form of life, and within that form of life, we have presentation and representation.
Yes. So my point is that, let's say, from this perspective here on top, Wittgenstein needs to be at the same time a pragmatist and an anti-philosopher, because his notion of use already wants to break with this barrier. Use is here. Use is not here, right?
In the both at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not only a descriptive. No. Yeah. So it's making this connection. He's trying to come up with a theory that breaks with a barrier that he himself posed there. You keep the problem of use here, but now there is no black box of existence. You can only tell. No, I can give you the general concept of use, tell you that it's localized to domains. I can call this a fucking form of life. I can call this a language game, but those are not black boxes. There is no threshold to cross. You can have the concept in philosophy, in a formal theory, and you can have the actual experience of stuff the way that they actually happen, with a much more heterogeneous relation to theory, if you go there to think with people what they're thinking.
And I think Badiou, with this way of thinking, is giving us a hint that probably that hint can help us why he resents linguistics. For Badiou, every form of thinking is localized. Every form of thinking is localized. There is no global form of thinking. The only global form of thinking is philosophy, which is actually is a sort of thinking that relies on local ways of thinking.
Yeah, he even said there's no truth propositions in philosophy, right?
Right. So every form of thinking is localized, and every localized domain of thinking has its own representation, which means that it has its own language. the problem with linguistics is that since the primacy of language is at stake for linguistics, I think there is an illusion that since language is something that is common across all forms of life, so there is a separate field of investigation about what language is. I think the way that Badiou debunks that is by saying that linguistics, or we can say that Badiou would say that linguistics is basically committing the same mistake as Hegel, that they think that there is the whole, which is the field of language itself, whereas for him the whole does not exist. So they are not committing to this axiom that the whole does not exist.
Yeah, that axiom comes here in this arrow, right? It's right. What motivates this arrow. So I need to have a concept of process and things together because there is no whole to be the general theory of the process.
So
or to be the general theory of
if you are a linguist, I was going to say, if you are a linguist and you accept that there is no whole, then you have to accept that the being of language or the instances of language are also local. There is no global language.
Yeah, but I think linguists, actual linguists, scientific linguists accept that. They accepted it 100 years ago.
They did?
Yeah. That's the whole, even Saussure, when we begins with the language, parole, distinction, and then trying to move towards a more abstract thing. I mean, Jacobson and everyone that came later, anthropology of language, it's all about showing that there is a family of languages, but there is no general concept of language. Some of them overlap, but there is no general structure that works for everything. It's philosophy that in some points sometimes argues that this is a general thing, but it's not.
So the question is not the debate between the philosophy of language or the language or the intelligibility through language, which is the primacy of human animal as the animal who has language. So it's not that problem, because that problem does not exist, because they accept the locality of language. So the only problem is that if you are talking about locality of intelligibility, forms of life, let's say, I really love this term that Wittgenstein has, forms of life. Within those forms of life, what does circumscribe that form of life? Is it its language, right?
No, I would say what in the Wittgensteinian sense, which is Wittgenstein is this kind of methodologically blurry philosopher, right? He tries to blur things because I'm closer to the phenomena when they are blurred, in a sense. So it's again a cluster. It's very similar to what Gabriel was saying. It's a cluster of doings, habits, language. Language emerges because there is some meaning to saying some things because we do some other things. So there is a context for that. So this is a form of life in the Wittgensteinian sense. So it's not exclusively linguistic, but language has nevertheless a certain methodological primacy because you kind of make, now I would use a Brandomian expression, you kind of make explicit what's going on through language. Things are implicit, rules are implicit, customs are implicit. You make explicit stating what is going on through language, in a sense. So language has this methodological importance.
But I have to think. It's been a while since I read Logical Investigation. I have to think that if he chose this term, form of life, as opposed to form of a language, right? He must have
language games and form of life.
Yeah, he has to be thinking about something that has primacy over a local language, right? So
no, it has primacy, but there you have to make a distinction that Wittgenstein would never make. But as an interpreter, I would make this distinction, which is a distinction between what has primacy in the order of being and what has primacy in the order of thought. So in order to describe something, you make explicit this through language, but in the order of being, no, it's a form of life that has primacy.
Right.
But you only you can only make this explicit language.
So I have to think. So I think this discussion has Gabriel started to draw this. There is no global intelligibility. You have only local intelligibility. So the next question is, what does circumscribe local intelligibility? For Badiou, it's not language. For Badiou, local intelligibility is what is at stake for thinking within that local intelligibility. Like, for example, for politics, what is at stake for politics as a form of intelligibility within each mode of politics, let's say, the way Lazarou defines it, is what is at stake is what people think. That is, or what are the possibilities that are available to people. That is what at stake. Now, apropos that what is at stake for thinking, for Badiou and Lazarou, then a particular set of concepts are developed. A particular set of definitions are developed. For example, class struggle. For example, state. For example, party. These concepts and particulars, these concepts and definitions are particular are local to a particular mode of politics which have a certain concern, right? So that is what is primary to Badiou. I think the difference between what Gabriel was writing comes down to what does circumscribe a form of life, right? And tie it to the previous discussion that we have. For Badiou, form of life is circumscribed by ideas or axioms, whereas it seems for linguists, form of life are, or there are two approaches. I'm not saying, I would like to think if you read Wittgenstein backwards from Badiou, you probably find within Wittgenstein a lot of Badiouian elements that he actually agrees that that form of life is actually circumscribed by engagements, by what matters to the engagement of people within a particular boundary. And then language comes after, right? So that is, and what Badiou adds to this kind of philosophical apparatus that we are talking about, locality of thinking and appearing, and then engagement and axioms as a way of circumscription of that engagement, all he's adding is a formalization apparatus. In order for us to understand the multiplicities within this, we can say presentation and representation at the level of ontology is formalized by set theory, and at the level of phenomenology is formalized by algebra or category theory. That's all he's adding to this. Yeah. But I think the way of thinking is very simple and clear, to me at least.
Yeah, but the thing that I wanted to get at that is that, again, look, this is the structure that we went through. It begins with this. There is no whole. I cannot have a general theory of reference. So you have local domains with local structures of what it means to refer, what it means to appear in a domain, things like this. Then he gives us a formal theory at this point that only we don't know what is here yet, but we do know that it is thinkable that what is here is structured by this transcendental structure, which is the locale, right? What he does then in section 4 is to say, don't worry, guys. Ordinary logic is homogeneous with this. People who are concerned about the theory of language that relates to a world will find their material in here as well. At this point, you could say, okay, what the fuck? Why am I going to go through all this trouble if at the end I'm going to just get what I already had? And I had to accept a bunch of weird theses beforehand, right? But then we get to the second chapter on the object, which then arrives at something more complex, which is the transcendental referring back to the world. In this non-black box kind of way, where we're just exploring all the consequences we can take from formally treating this in a homogeneous space. Because the same theory that will give us locales will give us topos theory, transcendental functors, or whatever, right? So you will get what you already had, plus some stuff that you didn't.
Yeah.
Which allows for more stuff to be thought. You don't lose what you had. This is still here. But you continue, you get more, because this remains homogeneous with a bunch of other stuff we haven't seen yet. Right?
So can I suggest, guys, it's past 8, some logistics stuff. So it was a great conversation. I think what comes out of it, I wanted us to see what we are doing, the next steps. So there is a paper that JP and Gabriel, you are working on, that you have referred to it like a couple of times in our talks. Is that paper something that you guys can present, or something that you are still working on?
We are working on it. I was going to present a few materials that I assembled. Some of it is very relevant to this discussion. For instance, Paul Livingston's reading of Badiou and the 4 orientations of thought that he comes up with, not the 3, because Badiou comes up with 3 in briefings on existence, right? I got the quote, but Livingston comes up with 4. That has everything to do with what we are discussing. Like okay. Livingston, there are 4 conditions. Like we're 2 of them are kind of stratified, are non-whole, doesn't accept a whole, and there is a 4th one that Badiou does not talk about, which is the paradoxical critical one, which accepts that language is a whole, but it is an inconsistent whole.
Which is Nelson Goodman?
No, this was Lacan, Derrida, Deleuze. I mean, a whole bunch of people. Yeah.
So there is that collection of thoughts, or that paper. There is another one that we discussed. Let's bring Lautman, and let's bring Lautman and read it with Frege and Carnap in order to understand the difference between definitional and axiomatic. So these are the 2 side investigations that we can launch and we can present. So 2 projects, and then the 3rd one is our reading. So my question is, we didn't get to your presentation this week at all, but we are kind of all waiting for object to start.
Let's go for object. I mean, we discussed everything I was going to discuss, but nevertheless it was more organized in my stuff. But we can maybe organize, I think you're getting at it, a parallel thing, another session, another thing wherein we can.
I would suggest the following. How about, Caron, we meet separately because it's been a long time since we discussed our project. Yeah. Perhaps you could bring the material you had today and we work through it together. When we are ready, we propose a side presentation, but next week we go to the next book and continue with the reading.
I agree. And I volunteer to look back at Lautman and suggest some readings from Lautman.
Yeah, I think the Carnap-Lautman thing is very nice.
So I don't know whether one of you, again, JP, as a different project, maybe you and I can get together and prepare something by the way of Lautman and Frege.
Yeah, that will be interesting.
That's nice. One thing I wanted to ask you guys, if not for next week, but for some moment, would moving our meeting from Friday to another day work for you? Because Friday 9 in the evening, it's kind of
I am okay. The only limitation I have, if it is Wednesday or Thursday, it would be after my 6 p.m. by 6:30 p.m.
I see.
So because I have a 5 to 6 session, 5 to 5:45, and just probably half an hour to eat something and get ready. Other than that, I am open all day. I can meet in the morning or at night.
No, I'll just propose some ideas then, and we can see what works.
Monday and Tuesday, I think it's okay for me. And
yeah, I was going to propose Monday. In fact, I think Monday for me would be the best. I'm not sure if it works for Dennis, but let's talk through. Yeah, let's talk through our private chat there and decide. I just proposed this because
I was mentioning today that we ought to move our meeting day because Friday is the day of political turmoil in Brazil. So,
yeah, it's already
Friday
there's
some big happening going on, so we have to move.
And Monday is political. Monday is turmoil within the stock market. So maybe it's Tuesday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's see how it goes. But I thought it was very productive, and I still think that, let's say, the stuff that you're bringing, Caron, remains, let's say, the thing that is making us think the most. So none of this is, really a side project. I think it's really kind of helping us to put this stuff in a better kind of base. But I do think we should find a way to move on with the reading, because some stuff will be clarified as we go along as well.
No, I agree completely. Let's go on to the object next meeting, and we meet separately and try to come up with something that will be more if not finished, but more finished, and the meeting will actually help us to finish our article.
I agree. I agree. Perfect.
And Reza, I have to meet with you if you still want to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is I'm going to do some reading on the stuff. So when I meet with you, I don't waste your time.
No, that's no waste of time. It's a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
And I will miss you tomorrow in Lazarou's stuff, man.
I wish I could go.
It was such an excellent presentation. I don't understand what you said. That was the feedback you received?
No, it was my impression that people were more interested in, let's say, how Lazarus works into French theory tradition and discussion, Marxist historiography, then, let's say, how he moved closer to politics. I don't think that was very much there what people were.
Was this recorded?
It was recorded. It was a very nice presentation of one of the chapters, but I think it's like a survey of the entire thought.
No, I like doing it, but I was a bit.
Can you give us a presentation on that?
Yeah, we could talk about it. I mean, it has a lot to do with what we're talking today.
Yeah, it's funny that during your presentation you mentioned that with Lazarou we should read model theory. My paper is finally getting to the production phase about Lazarou and model theory.
Well, why do you think I mentioned it? It was a reference to you. I thought you were there. Like I was trying to bring you.
Unfortunately, I wasn't.
Yeah, it was a pity. Guys, I need to run.
Okay.
Very late.
Take care.
Okay, we'll talk. See everyone.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.